Namaste everyone, I'm your co-host Shawnee ma'am. Welcome to your favorite learning channel. The topic for today's video is pollination and its types. So pollination is a process that takes place in the flowers, okay? So before understanding what is pollination, let's see how many types of flowers exist, okay? So first let's talk about the types of flowers, and by this time we already know that flowers are the reproductive structures in plants. They help in sexual reproduction in plants, okay? So the first type of flowers are those having all the four holes. Flowers having that have all the four holes, that is we have studied, they are petals, sepals, stamen and pistil. So the flowers that have all these four parts or all these four holes are called, they are called what? They are called complete flowers. Okay, this is a type of flower called complete flowers. So in this case they have both, what do they have? They have both the male and the female reproductive parts, that is the male reproductive part is also known as the andrecium, and the female reproductive part, that is gynecium respectively. Okay, so these flowers have both the male as well as the female reproductive parts, right? Hence they are also known as what? They are also known as bisexual flowers. So bisexual flowers are actually complete flowers that have all the four holes, and complete flowers are those which have all the four holes, okay? Then bisexual flowers are also a type of complete flowers. In bisexual flowers, both the male and female reproductive parts are present. For example, we can see this type of flowers in rose, etc. Okay, so this was the first type. Now let's talk about the other type of flower, where the flowers that either lack male or the female reproductive part. So in these flowers, either male reproductive part or the female reproductive part will be missing, and these are known as here one of the parts would be missing. These are known as incomplete. They are incomplete flowers, and we can say that these types of flowers can be found in papaya, etc. Okay, so these flowers are actually unisexual because only one of the reproductive part is present. Hence these flowers are unisexual. Okay, so these unisexual flowers can be further categorized based on the presence or absence of the male and female part. That is, we can categorize them as unisexual flowers, as we call them. We can further categorize them as pistillate or staminate flowers. So in pistillate, they only have the female part. In staminate flowers, such flowers only have the male part. Okay, so these are unisexual flowers. So here we have covered the different types of flowers. Okay, now let's see what is pollination. Okay, so how would we define the term pollination? So pollination is actually a process. It is a process by which what happens here is by which the pollen grains, here the pollen grains from anther, pollen grains are present in anther, we had already studied, of a stamen, that is the male reproductive part. These pollen grains are transferred. They are transferred to where? To the stigma. To the stigma of the pistil of the same flower. Okay, so stigma of the pistil of either the same flower or into another flower. Another flower. Okay, so this process is known as pollination. So pollination can occur either naturally or artificially. So pollination, we can say that pollination can occur either by natural means. So it can occur either naturally or it can occur by artificial means, that is artificially. Okay. So first up we will see what is natural pollination. So in case of natural pollination, the pollination is taking place by natural means. So natural pollination is again of two types. One is self-pollination. Self-pollination, and the other type is cross-pollination. Okay, so first let's see what is self-pollination now. So self-pollination is a type of natural pollination. Okay, so here what happens is, in this process pollen grains from the anthers of a flower. Okay, so pollen grains from the anther of a flower, they are transferred. They are transferred to where? They are transferred to the stigma. They are transferred to the stigma of the same flower, or another flower, or to another flower, but this another flower should be of the same plant. Okay, so this is self-pollination. Now let's see what is cross-pollination. So what happens in cross-pollination? So it is a type of natural pollination. So in this process, pollen grains from anther, pollen grains from pollen grains from the anther of a flower, okay, they are transferred transferred. Where they are transferred? They are transferred to the stigma of another flower. Another flower on a different plant that is present on a different plant, but this different plant is of the same variety. Okay, so this is what we call cross-pollination. Okay, so cross-pollination can be carried out by various agents. This is carried out, cross-pollination is carried out by various agents. Okay, and these agents are called as, which carry out the cross-pollination, are called as pollinating. They are known as pollinating agents. So these agents can be, example, wind, okay, water, etc. They can be insects. Okay, so these are the different pollinating agents that help in carrying out the process of cross pollination. So now let's see how different agents help in cross pollination. So the first agent would be pollination by insects. Okay, so insects are also one of the agents of cross pollination. So this is the most common method of natural pollination. Okay, so this one is most common method of what? Of natural pollination. That is, insects are the most common agents that bring about the natural pollination. So for example, these insects could be bees, butterflies and other insects. So we can say etc. Okay, so these insects, they sit on the flowers so that they are able to collect the nectar or juice from the flowers. So while they are collecting this nectar from the flowers, the pollen grains from the anther, they get stuck onto the body of these insects, and when these insects again visit some other flower to obtain nectar, these pollen grains get deposited on the stigma of another flower, and this is how pollination is brought about by these insects. Okay, so flowers that are pollinated by insects, or we can say the insect pollinated flowers, how they are actually? These flowers are usually large. Okay, they are brightly colored. And often they are scented. Okay, so these characteristics of flowers, we can take an example. These characteristics of flowers, they actually help in attracting the insects towards them. So these characteristics can be found in flowers like roses, okay, then marigold, etc. Okay, so in order to attract insects, their pollen grains and stigma are usually sticky. So in some other flowers, what happen is, to attract insects, what happens? the pollen grains and stigma. They are usually sticky. For example, in case of strawberries we can find in strawberries the flowers have pollen grains and stigma that are sticky, and this helps in attracting the insects. Okay, so this was about pollination by insects. Next, move on to the next agent, that is pollination by water. So this type of pollination it occurs in aquatic plants. Example, hydrilla. Okay, so hydrilla is an aquatic plant. Then in vallisneria, okay, so vallisneria, etc. So these are aquatic plants where the pollination takes place by the means of water. Okay, vallisneria, etc. Okay, so what happens is flowers that are pollinated by water. So here, how are the flowers? Here the flowers are, they are of lightweight. Okay, they are lightweight. So that, why are they lightweight? Because this helps them to easily float on the water surface, and these flowers, they do not produce nectar. They also do not produce nectar. Okay, so these are the characteristics of the flowers which are pollinated by means of water. So the next agent we will talk about is pollination that takes place by wind. Okay, so in this type of pollination, what happens? Pollen grains are carried by, here the pollen grains are carried, they are carried by wind. Okay, and they get deposited on stigma. Okay, so the pollen grains are produced in large quantities here, so that at least some have a chance to reach the stigma, because it is the wind that is carrying the pollen grains. There are chances that many of the pollen grains might not land on the stigma. Hence, in this case, pollen grains are produced in large amounts or large quantities, so that at least some of them, that is, some of the pollen grains, have a chance to reach the stigma. So most of the wind pollinated flowers, how are they? Let's see. So here the flowers are small. And they have dry and light pollen grains. Okay, so their pollen grains are dry and light, which can be easily carried by wind. Okay, so for example, this type of pollination can be seen in case of rice, maize, etc. Okay, so this was about the natural pollination. Now let's talk about artificial pollination. Okay, so what is artificial pollination? So here what happens is, in this process two different varieties of plants are selected. Here two different varieties of plants are selected. Okay, because this is artificially being made, so we can select the types of plants that we want. Okay, so both the plants that are selected, both with, they have certain required characteristics or traits, we can say. Certain desired traits are, the plants having certain required or desired traits are selected to produce new variety of plants. To produce a new variety of plant. Okay, so this is done in case of artificial pollination. So this method, it helps in increasing genetic diversity, because different flowers will share and combine their genetic information for creating unique offsprings, right? So it helps in increasing the genetic diversity. This method, it helps in increasing what? Increasing genetic diversity. As I told, because here different flowers will share and combine their genetic information to create unique offsprings. Okay, so for example, how it occurs is, a plant with disease resistance property, plant having disease resistant, or we can say disease resistance. Okay, the plant having the property of disease resistance, and some other plant with, that has high yielding property, they are selected. Okay, these can be selected, these type of traits, required traits, are selected. So plants having these required traits can be selected, and after selecting they are made to crossbreed, and after these plants are being selected, they are made to crossbreed. Okay, so here we can crossbreed by the means of artificial pollination. Okay, and this will lead to the production of a new variety of plant which will have characteristics from both the parents. So this will lead to the formation or production, we can say. This will lead to the production of a new variety of plant, of a new plant variety, and this will having the properties, of both the parent plants, right? So this artificial cross pollination of rice is very common in field of agriculture. Okay, so artificial pollination can be seen in rice. Okay, here in rice, artificial pollination is very common in the field of agriculture. Okay, so now let's just quickly revise everything that we have studied today. Okay, so today we talked about pollination, and before defining the term pollination, we talked about the different types of flowers. So we saw that there are two different types of flowers. One type of flowers are those which have all the four holes, that is petals, sepals, stamen and pistil present, and such type of flowers are called complete flowers. So as all the holes are present, they are having both the male as well as the female reproductive parts, that is androecium and gynoecium are present respectively, and hence these are also known as bisexual flowers, for example rose, etc. Then in other type of flowers, there is a lack, or these flowers lack either the male or the female reproductive part, and hence these are known as incomplete flowers, for example papaya, etc. And as here only one of the reproductive parts are present, these flowers are also known as unisexual flowers, which can be further categorized as pistillate flowers and staminate flowers. So pistillate flowers will be having only the female reproductive part, and staminate flowers will be having only the male reproductive part. Then we talked about pollination. So pollination can be defined as a process by which the pollen grains which are present in the anther of a stamen are actually transferred. They are transferred to where? They are transferred to the stigma of the pistil of the same flower, or into the other flower, into some other flower. Okay, so this pollination can be either natural or artificial. So natural pollination can again be of two types, that is either self-pollination or cross-pollination. So self-pollination is a process where pollen grains from the anthers of a flower are transferred to the stigma of either the same flower or to another flower, but this another flower is also of the same plant. Okay, then in cross pollination, what happens is the pollen grains from the anther of the flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower on a different plant. So this is cross pollination. So cross pollination is carried out by several pollinating agents like wind, water, etc. So insects are also an agent of pollination. So in case of pollination that takes place by insects, what happens is this form of pollination is the most common method of natural pollination. So the insects could be bees, butterflies, etc. Here we can see an image of pollination. Okay, so here the pollination is being carried out by butterfly. It is an example of insect pollination or pollination by insects. Okay, so this is the most common type of natural pollination. So what happens here? The insects help in bringing out the pollination. So the pollen grains are actually sticky in this case. So what happens is the insects actually come to the flowers to collect the nectar or juice. So while they do so, the pollen grains from the anther, they get stuck into the body of the insects. So when these insects again go and visit some other flower, these pollen grains that are stuck onto their body gets deposited on the stigma of another flower, and this is how the pollination is brought about. So the flowers which are pollinated by insects are actually or usually large, brightly colored and often scented. For example, in case of rose, marigold, etc. Then to attract insects, these flowers have pollen grains and stigma that are sticky. For example, in case of strawberries. Okay. Then the next pollinating agent we talked about was water. So this type of pollination occurs in aquatic plants, for example hydrilla, vallisneria, etc. So these flowers which are pollinated by water, they are usually light in weight so that they can easily float on the surface of water, and these flowers, they do not produce nectar. Then the next pollinating agent was wind. So here the pollen grains are carried by wind, which get deposited on stigma. So in case of flowers that are pollinated by wind, they are small and the pollen grains that they produce are dry and light. This type of pollination can be seen in the case of rice, maize, etc. Okay, so this was about the different agents that bring cross pollination, which is a type of natural pollination. Then we talked about artificial pollination. So artificial pollination is a process where two different varieties of plants are selected that have certain required traits, and these selected plants are then these are used for the production of new variety of plant. Okay, so this process of artificial pollination actually helps in increasing the genetic diversity, because here different flowers that share different that have different characteristics, they combine their genetic information to create unique offspring. Thus genetic diversity increases. So for example, what happens is, suppose a plant having disease resistance property is selected and another plant having high yielding property. These two plants are selected, and after being selected, they are made to crossbreed by artificial pollination, and this method results in production of new plant variety, and this new plant variety will now have the properties of both the parents, that is both the parent plants. So the process of cross pollination of rice, okay, so this is a type of artificial pollination, okay, not a cross pollination process, but the artificial pollination that takes place in rice is very common in the field of agriculture. Okay, so I hope you all would have got some great insights by watching today's video. Please do not forget to like and share the video. Till then, thank you for watching.